There is a city in southern Italy where time stopped on a single morning, where the bread was left in the oven, where the wine was left on the table, where doors stood open to streets that no one ever came back to close, where the graffiti on the walls still carries the voice of someone who scratched their words into plaster 2,000 years ago and walked away, never knowing those words would last longer than everything else they ever did. That city is Pompeii. And tonight, we are going to walk through it. Not as it was frozen, but as it lived. Because Pompeii is far older than the morning it disappeared. It had centuries of life behind it before the mountain ever stirred. Centuries of markets and elections, of loves and arguments, of children born and elders buried, of wars fought and lost and survived. It was a city that rose and fell and rose again, shaped by wave after wave of peoples, languages, conquests, and transformations. The mountain took one morning from Pompeii, but the city had already been given hundreds of years. Tonight, we give those years back. So settle in, let the world outside go quiet, and let the streets of Pompeii open before you, slowly, gently, the way a city reveals itself to someone who is willing to simply walk and listen.
But a city is not its last day. A city is every day that came before, every market morning and quiet evening, every election and argument and shared meal, every generation of children who grew up playing in streets their grandparents had built. Pompeii lived for 700 years before the mountain ever spoke. Tonight, we're going to walk those years together. We'll begin at the very beginning, when there was no city here at all, only a wide coastal plain, a river moving toward the sea, and a volcano that had been silent for so long that no one alive could remember it speaking. We'll follow the people who chose this land and made it their home. We'll watch the city grow through conquest and commerce, through wars fought and survived, through centuries of transformation that turned a cluster of farming villages into one of the most vivid and complete cities the ancient world ever produced. We'll be there when the earth shook. We will be there in the final summer, when the grapes were ripening and the streets were full and the mountain gave no warning at all. We'll walk through the eruption and through the long silence that followed, centuries in which the city lay sealed beneath the earth, forgotten by everyone except the soil that held it perfectly. And we'll be there when it came back. So let your body settle now. Let the weight of the day lift off your shoulders. The world outside can wait. For the next little while, there is only this, the warm southern light on ancient stone, the sound of a city going about its life, and a story that has been waiting, patient as the ash itself, to be told. Before there was a city, there was a mountain. It rose at the edge of a coastal plain in the south of Italy, broad and unhurried, its slopes thick with forest, its summit open to the blue sky. For thousands of years it had done what volcanoes do. It had erupted again and again, laying down deep layers of dark ash across the surrounding land. But by the time our story begins, all of that was long ago. The mountain was quiet now. Its slopes had gone green, and the land at its feet was extraordinary. The volcanic soil of the Sarno Plain was unlike anything else in the ancient world. Mineral-rich and dark, soft to the plow, and deep with fertility. It grew olives heavy with oil and grapevines that produced wine so strong and dark it had a reputation across the Mediterranean. Whatever a farmer planted here, the earth returned it generously. In the 8th century before the Common Era, a people called the Oscans came down from the highland interior of Italy and settled at the edge of this plain. They were practical, patient people, farmers and herders who read the land the way experienced sailors read the sea. And what they read in this particular stretch of earth told them everything they needed to know. They built their homes on a low ridge of ancient lava that jutted slightly above the plain, a natural platform with clear views in every direction, the river curling below, the mountain rising above. They planted their fields. They raised their animals. They built simple huts of wood and stone clustered together in small communities. In time, those communities grew into 5 separate villages, sharing the same elevated ground. And in the Oscan language, the word for 5 was Pom. So the place became Pompeii, the settlement of the 5 torn. Not a grand name. Not a name that announced ambition or power. Just an honest count of what was there. For generations, life here moved in the slow, reliable rhythm of the seasons. The mountains stood silent above them. The river ran. The soil gave what it always gave. And the people of those 5 small villages built something quietly enduring in the warm southern air. Then the sea changed everything. Around 740 BC, Greek colonists crossed from the other side of the Mediterranean and founded a city on the far shore of the bay. They called it Cumae, and it was the first Greek settlement on the Italian mainland. These were not farmers. They were traders and navigators, people who saw the Mediterranean not as a boundary but as a road. And the mouth of the Sarno River, leading directly into the fertile heart of Campania, was exactly the kind of road they were looking for. The Greeks came to trade. They brought painted pottery, bronze vessels, finely woven cloth, and a more refined variety of wine. In return, they wanted timber, rain, and the thick, dark olive oil the volcanic soil produced in such abundance. What began as a commercial relationship slowly became something deeper. Oscan craftsmen began studying the shapes and painted figures on Greek pottery, blending foreign techniques with their own tradition. Local leaders saw what wealth, through commerce, could build. A new kind of thinking arrived on the plateau, one that connected this small farming settlement to a much larger world. The most powerful symbol of this new influence appeared sometime in the 6th century. On the highest visible edge of the plateau, the people of Pompeii built a temple. Not a simple local shrine of rough stone and timber, but a proper Doric temple in the full Greek style, columns rising in clean lines above the cliff, visible from the water, announcing to every passing ship that this place understood the wider world and intended to be part of it. That temple still existed when Pompeii was buried. It is the oldest structure the ash preserved, older than the walls, older than the forum, older than everything else. A stone memory of the moment a small farming community first looked beyond the horizon. While the Greeks were reshaping Pompeii from the coast, another great civilization was pressing down from the north. The Etruscans were among the most sophisticated people on the Italian peninsula. Builders, metalworkers, traders, and when necessary, warriors. Their most important foothold in the south was the city of Capua, and from there their influence spread outward through Campania. Pompeii was drawn into their orbit, not by force, but by the pull of commerce and political alignment. Under Etruscan influence, trade along the Sarno grew more regular. The city's first true defensive walls were built, enclosing not just the settlement itself, but a ring of farmland beyond it, so that even a besieged city could feed itself. It was careful, far-sighted planning, but Etruscan ambition pushed too far. In 474 BC, their fleet met the Greek ships in open water and suffered a catastrophic defeat. Their naval power was broken. Their hold on Campania dissolved almost immediately. Trade dried up. Ships stopped coming. The roads fell quiet. Pompeii contracted back into itself, small, local, and overshadowed once more. It would not stay that way for long. From the Redol, high mountain interior of Italy, a new force was descending. The Samnites were a fierce, independent people who shared the same ancient Oscan heritage as Pompeii's original settlers. They spoke the same language. They honored the same gods. And when they pressed down from the highlands into Campania, Pompeii's arrival under their control felt less like conquest and more like a homecoming. The Oscan language returned to public life. Trade revived. Stability returned. And the Samnite families, who established themselves as Pompeii's new ruling class, built with a confidence and an ambition the city had never quite shown before. The Forum was reorganized and given architectural definition. A covered theater was constructed, and the defensive walls were entirely rebuilt. 2 parallel faces of hard limestone, with a packed earth core between them. A rampart of extraordinary solidity. Behind those walls, Samnite Pompeii reached a kind of prosperous contentment. The farms were productive. The trade routes were open. The mountain above the plain stood green and still. Then Rome arrived. The Roman Republic in the 4th century before our era was not yet an empire. It was a governed city-state on the Tiber, disciplined, law-bound, and possessed of a citizen army that was unlike anything the ancient world had produced. Rome expanded not through a single king's ambition, but through the slow, grinding logic of a system that measured security in terms of territory, controlled and peoples absorbed. For the Samnites, this expansion was an existential threat. 3 great wars were fought over more than 50 years, brutal campaigns in mountain passes and river valleys. The Samnites were courageous and skilled. At one famous engagement, at a narrow pass called the Caudine Forks, they forced an entire Roman army to surrender. Rome never forgot it. And Rome always came back. By 290 BC, the Samnite Confederation was broken. Pompey's choice was stark: stand and be destroyed, or yield and survive. The city chose survival. It became a Roman ally, a socius, allowed to govern its own internal affairs, allowed to keep its magistrates and its traditions, but obligated to supply soldiers for Rome's endless wars and denied the full rights of Roman citizenship. For nearly 2 centuries, Pompeii lived within this arrangement. Protected by Roman power, the city prospered. The Forum was expanded. Public baths appeared. A great theater was built. But beneath the comfort, something was building. Generation after generation, Pompeian men fought in Roman armies across the Mediterranean. They helped build an empire they were not permitted to share. In 91 BC, when the Roman Senate refused once again to grant citizenship to the Italian allies, the patience that had held for 2 centuries finally broke. The social war erupted across the peninsula. Pompeii joined the uprising. For the first time in a century, the Oscan language returned to the city's public inscriptions. Men who had thought of themselves as Roman allies remembered who they were before Rome. Rome dispatched Lucius Cornelius Sulla to crush the rebellion in Campania. His legions arrived at Pompeii's gates in 89 BC. The defenders took their positions on the great limestone ramparts and held. The stone-throwing artillery hammered the northern wall for weeks. The wall did not break. The scars of those impacts are still visible in the stone today. But the wider rebellion was collapsing. City after city across Campania fell. Pompeii stood firm and alone. With no allies left, the gates were opened. The city surrendered, unbroken in its walls, but broken in a different way. When Sulla returned from civil war and eastern campaigns nearly a decade later, he issued his judgment. Pompeii was to be refounded as a Roman colony. His veterans, thousands of battle-hardened soldiers, were settled in the city and given the best houses, the best farmland, the most prominent positions. The old families were dispossessed. Oscan retreated from the Forum forever. A new city was beginning. And it would become something extraordinary. The city that emerged from Sulla's settlement was neither purely Roman nor purely Samnite. It was something new. A hybrid place shaped by 7 centuries of successive influences, now finally settled into the form that history would preserve. And it built with remarkable ambition. The Forum was transformed into a proper Roman civic space. Colonnaded walkways framing its long sides, temples renovated and faced with fresh architectural treatments, a great basilica rising along one edge where the court sat and merchants formalized their contracts. Statues of emperors and generals were placed across the open paving, turning the Forum into an open-air gallery of Roman power. To cross it in the morning was to move through the full weight of the civilization that claimed this city. Beyond the Forum, the houses of the wealthy expanded. Behind the traditional atrium, that large skylit hall with its shallow rainwater pool, peristyle gardens were added. Colonnaded courtyards open to the sky, their planted beds and fountains carefully arranged, sculptures of bronze and marble standing at composed intervals. These gardens were not wild things. They were nature made architectural, beauty made intentional. The walls of the reception rooms were covered in paintings of extraordinary ambition, architectural fantasies in which columns and archways receded into impossible painted landscapes, mythological scenes rendered with genuine feeling, figures posed with a psychological naturalism that still has the power to stop people in their tracks. The colors: deep Pompeian red, warm saffron yellow, cream white, remain, in the best preserved rooms, essentially as vivid as the day they were applied. The streets were paved in hard volcanic basalt, large irregular stones fitted tight enough to last for millennia. Stepping stones crossed the wider intersections at exactly the right height. Fountains at every major corner ran, constantly, fed by the aqueduct that brought mountain spring water into the city's distribution towers. The water ran day and night. It ran on the last morning, too. The public baths were rebuilt on a generous scale. Vaulted ceilings of stucco relief, marble-lined pools, changing rooms with shelved niches for clothing. They were far more than places to wash. They were the great social institution of Roman city life, places where the full range of the city's free population could meet on roughly equal terms in the fragrant warmth of the bathing halls. Deals were made. Friendships were maintained. Information moved from person to person the way information always moves in any human community, through proximity and repetition. The amphitheater at the eastern edge of the city, the oldest permanent Roman amphitheater in the world, its oval walls still standing, filled on fight days with crowds that came from across the region. 20,000 people on some occasions. More than the city's entire resident population. Pompeii was not a capital. It was not a military stronghold. It was simply a city that had learned over long centuries to live very well. Enter the city in the early morning, when the light is still low, and the stone holds the cool of the night. The first thing you notice is the smell. Bread. More than 30 bakeries are distributed through Pompeii's neighborhoods, and they begin their work before dawn. The great volcanic millstones turn in their courtyards, upper stone grinding over lower, the grain falling through in a slow, constant stream, becoming flour. The flour is mixed, kneaded on worn stone counters, shaped into round loaves, and slid into domed ovens that burn all night. When the excavators finally arrived, 81 of those loaves were still in an oven. 2,000 years in the ash. Still recognizable as bread. The main streets are lined with shops. Every ground floor along the principal arteries is given over to commerce. Wooden shutters folded back at first light, small dark interiors reveal. A textile seller arranges bolts of dyed cloth. A coppersmith lays out his tools. A wine cellar stands behind a stone counter with ceramic jars sunk into its surface, each one holding a different variety. Customers stop, taste, negotiate, and move on. The city's wine was famous. The volcanic soil produced grapes of unusual richness, and Campanian wine moved across the Roman Empire in tall sealed amphorae, stacked in the holds of merchant ships. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the essential condiment of Roman cooking, was another major product, processed from the bay's rich catch in factories along the waterfront. The wool trade was organized into powerful guilds. Election notices painted on the walls record the fuller's formal endorsement of political candidates. Those elections were genuinely contested. Every spring, the citizens voted for their magistrates, and the campaigns were conducted with energy that anyone today would recognize. Painted notices covered every available wall surface. The bakers endorsed one man. The goldsmiths endorsed another. One notice, clearly posted by an opponent, announces that all the late-night drinkers support a particular candidate for city office. The graffiti on Pompeii's walls is one of its most intimate survivals. Not the official inscriptions, but the casual, scratched messages left by people going about their lives. A declaration of love near the theater. A price someone needed to remember. A complaint about a neighbor. A name written alone, for no apparent reason, except the oldest human reason of all. I was here. I existed. This wall knows it. In the afternoon heat, the wealthier families retreated to their peristyle gardens and the cool shade of their colonnaded walkways. At dusk, the dinner parties began, guests reclining on cushioned couches, dishes arriving in succession, conversation flowing alongside the wine, slaves moving silently between the courses. The walls of the dining rooms were painted with scenes of feasting gods, as if divine authority had been granted to pleasure itself. It was, by any measure, a good place to be alive. In February of the year 62 AD, the earth beneath Pompeii moved. Not gently. A major seismic event rolled through the city before dawn, cracking walls and collapsing columns that had stood for centuries. The great temple of Jupiter on the Forum fell. The water system that fed the city's fountains failed across entire neighborhoods. When the shaking stopped, Pompeii was badly damaged. But it was not abandoned. The response that followed was remarkable in its energy. The city threw itself. itself into one of the most ambitious building campaigns of its entire history. Wealthy families renovated their houses and commissioned fresh paintings, the most elaborate decorative work the city had ever produced. New water installations were built and tested. Public buildings were repaired. New businesses opened. Work in progress was everywhere when the ash finally came. Fresh plaster not yet painted, mosaic pavements not yet grouted, scaffolding against walls that were nearly finished. Pompeii fully expected to continue. The summer of 79 AD was hot, as southern Italian summers always are. The grapes on the mountain slopes were ripening toward harvest. The figs were heavy on the trees. The bay shimmered in the afternoon heat. The city moved at the slower pace of the hottest months. Markets busy in the morning cool, streets quieter in the long afternoon, the fountains running as they always ran. There had been small tremors in recent weeks. Felt, but not much remarked on. The earth trembled sometimes in this part of Italy. It always had. In one house, a family set aside a collection of silver objects, cleaning them after use or perhaps storing them during renovation. They never retrieved them. In a shop near the Forum, a man counted out a collection of coins from across the empire. He put them away. He never came back. In the bakery near the theater, 81 round loaves went into the oven. The morning of August 24th, or possibly a date in October, scholars still debate this, began as mornings in Pompeii always began. The bakers lit their fires. The shopkeepers opened their shutters. The mountain stood above the plain, green and enormous, and perfectly still. Then the mountain opened. The eruption began with an explosion that sent a column of ash and gas miles into the sky. From across the bay, the writer Pliny, the younger, watched it rise and spread outward at the top like the canopy of an umbrella pine. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, commander of the Roman naval fleet, ordered ships made ready. He crossed the bay toward the fire. In Pompeii, the column was visible to everyone. Then the pumice began to fall. It fell like heavy gray rain. Lightweight fragments of volcanic rock, carried by the wind and dropping onto rooftops that were already weakened by the earthquake 17 years before. At first it was strange, not yet terrifying. People came into the streets to look. They watched the column rising from the mountain and did not fully understand what they were seeing. Then the roofs began to buckle. Some people left early. They gathered what they could carry: a purse of coins, jewelry, the household's sacred objects, and moved toward the city gates, away from the mountain, toward the sea or the roads leading inland. Some of those people survived. Others stayed. Perhaps they believed the worst would pass. Perhaps they could not leave. The elderly, the injured, those who could not abandon what they had spent a lifetime building. They sheltered in the more solidly built rooms of their houses and waited for the rain of stones to stop. It didn't stop. Through the afternoon and into the night, the pumice accumulated on the streets until walking was difficult. The air thickened with fine ash and sulfurous gas. People pressed cloth over their mouths and noses. The sky stayed dark. The mountain kept speaking. Then, in the early hours after midnight, the character of the eruption changed. The great column that had held itself aloft by explosive force began to collapse under its own weight. As it fell back toward the mountain, it generated something the ancient world had no language for: a wave of superheated gas and ash and fragmented rock, moving faster than anything alive could outrun. The first surge reached Herculaneum, the smaller city on the mountain's western slope. It arrived in seconds. It arrived at temperatures that ended life instantly and completely. Several more surges followed through the early morning hours, each one reaching further across the plain. The fourth surge reached Pompeii, moved through the city's streets like a final decision. The people who were still inside, those who had waited, those who had sheltered, those who had hoped, were overtaken in moments. The wealthy and the poor, the old and the young, the free and the enslaved, the baker who had not yet taken the bread out of the oven. When the surge passed, the city was gone. The buildings that still stood were filled and covered with meters of ash and volcanic deposit. The streets disappeared. The Forum, the temples, the painted houses, the fountains still running, all of it swallowed in the span of a single night. A city that had been alive and noisy and full of bread smells and election arguments and dinner parties fell absolutely silent, and stayed that way for nearly 1700 years. After the eruption, survivors returned to a landscape they barely recognized. The plain had changed. The coastline had shifted. Where Pompeii had been, there was now a flat, gray surface, from which a few of the tallest structures still barely projected. And then, as the years passed, and the weather worked on what little showed, not even those, the city sank beneath memory as completely as it sank beneath the earth. The Roman writer, Pliny the Younger, who had watched the eruption from across the bay as a 17-year-old, and wrote 2 letters about what he saw that remain among the most vivid accounts of any disaster in the ancient world, kept the city's name alive in literature. Poets and historians mentioned it as an example of catastrophe, of the fragility of human achievement. But no one could visit it. There was nothing to visit. There was only the gray plain, and beneath it, the silence. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The medieval world that grew over the region had no awareness of what lay beneath its fields. Farmers sometimes plowed up fragments, shards of pottery, pieces of carved stone, and set them aside as curiosities. No one knew what they meant. In 1748, organized excavation began. A Spanish military engineer led the first work at a site local people called La Civita, the Old City. Within days, the workers were finding walls, paintings, household objects lying where they had been left on a morning nearly 1700 years before. The scale of the preservation, rooms still standing, colors still vivid, objects still in place, was unlike anything anyone had encountered. News of the discoveries reached the educated world of 18th century Europe and caused a sensation. Writers, artists, and architects crossed the continent to see for themselves. What they found transformed their understanding of the ancient world, and through that transformation, transformed Western art and architecture. The neoclassical movement that shaped the design of an era drew directly from the buildings and paintings being pulled out of the Campanian earth. But the excavations of the early period were not careful work. Valuable objects were removed, and their precise locations rarely documented. Paintings that could not be transported were sometimes damaged or destroyed. The information embedded in context, where each object sat in relation to every other object, was treated as irrelevant when the objects themselves were the prize. It would take another century, and a particular kind of mind, to understand what was really being lost. In 1863, a man named Giuseppe Fiorelli became director of the Pompeii excavations. He was methodical in a way his predecessors had not been. He divided the site into numbered regions and blocks. He required systematic documentation. He moved the work slowly and carefully, area by area. And he understood something about the hollow spaces in the ash. Throughout the volcanic deposits, wherever a human being had died and been buried by the ash, there remained a void. As the centuries passed, the organic material of the body decayed. But the ash that had settled around it, fine enough to capture every detail, and hard enough to hold the shape, preserved the exact impression of the person who had been there. Fiorelli understood that these cavities were molds. He had his workers drill small holes into them and pour liquid plaster inside. When the plaster hardened and the surrounding ash was carefully removed, what emerged were 3-dimensional casts of the people of Pompeii at the moment the eruption ended their lives. The first complete cast stopped everyone who saw it. A person lying on their side, one arm raised toward their face. The fabric of their clothing pressed in detail against their body. Completely recognizable as a human being. Completely real. More followed. A family group. Parents apparently trying to shield their children with their bodies in a final instinctive act. A chained dog, its legs twisted in its last struggle. A man with his toga pulled over his face. A woman with her jewelry still beside her. Each cast collapsed 2,000 years in an instant. They were not monuments. They were not art. They were people. People who had been alive in this city on a morning that had no reason to be any different from the morning before it. Pompeii today receives millions of visitors from every part of the world. They walk the streets paved 17 centuries ago. They look at paintings applied to plaster walls in a city that has been dead longer than most nations have existed. They read the graffiti, the declarations of love, the political endorsements, the complaints, the jokes, the names scratched alone. And they hear in those simple marks the unmistakable sound of other human beings trying to leave some trace of themselves in the world. Above it all, the mountain still stands. It is not erupting now. But volcanologists who study it will tell you clearly, it will erupt again. More than 3 million people live in the area surrounding it. The soil is extraordinary. The light in the afternoons is extraordinary. The bay is as blue as it was the morning the mountain opened. And the people who live there stay. Because roots, once they go deep enough, hold against almost anything. Pompeii was buried. It was forgotten. It was found. And what it tells us, more completely than almost any other place on Earth, is something that needed no ash to preserve, that people have always lived fully, right up to the edge of what they could not predict. The bread was in the oven. The wine was on the table. The doors were open to the street. And then the morning ended. Sleep well.